just your favourite one. Written the same year as the Jameson satellite, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World is a dystopian classic that also predicted the widespread use of chemical antidepressants. Soma is the novel's mood-altering pill, which soothes and placates the population. Huxley's vision predated prescription antidepressants by 20 years, but once the link between chemicals and depressants was established, their popularity soared. Prozac quickly became ubiquitous in Western society, and was the third most commonly prescribed drug in the US by 2008. From 5th place on the 20th century's best English novels, we moved to a sci-fi novel that was almost universally derided for the quality of its writing. The oddly named Ralph 124C41+. Its title, a play on words as 124C for one another, may be the peak of its artistic merit, but Ralph is packed with successful predictions. Alongside solar energy, tape recorders, and not only television, but even idle channel surfing, the novel contains a detailed description of exactly how radar would work. When Marconi made a working radar in 1933, Ralph may as well have been the instruction manual. There's even a passage about video calling, where a character uses a video phone called a telephot to see and talk with a friend. But if we're talking about famous sci-fi Skype predecessors, we can't ignore 2001: A Space Odyssey. Alongside the news pads that look remarkably like iPads, the film's picture phone captivated audiences, with multiple attempts to make them successful over the years. In the very same scene, Dr. Floyd inserts what looks like a credit card to start the call. Given they were far less common in the 1960s, this prediction of the ubiquity they'd later enjoy is fairly impressive. Credit cards were also predicted in sci-fi as far back as 1887. In Edward Bellamy's novel Looking Backwards, which told the story of a man who goes to sleep that year and wakes up in the year 2000. Bellamy's description of these credit cards included that each person used his to procure at the public storehouses found in every community whatever he desires, whenever he desires it, which totally obviates business transactions of any sort between individuals and customers. And, well, if that isn't a description of ordering something off Amazon and collecting it from a self-service locker, I don't know what is. Sticking with modern conveniences, arguably even more essential than a credit card to many people these days is a mobile phone. Alongside the tachyon beams and photon torpedoes, Star Trek inspired the first mobile phone. Motorola engineer Martin Cooper based his prototype on Captain Kirk's communicator. Although at £2.5 and with just 20 minutes of battery life, I'm not sure many people would consider it particularly mobile by modern standards. Still, it paved the way for smaller phones that eventually led to the screens we love being glued to today. Star Trek also features replicators that can print food and objects in seconds, and whilst I don't think these directly inspired 3D printers, they definitely were a sign of things to come. There are even companies who now claim to be able to separate and put together individual molecules, in essence allowing us to build almost anything from its most basic building blocks. Onto another inspired handheld device, except this one definitely isn't something you want to hold to your ear. Nuclear physicist Jack Cover made the first stun gun in the 1970s, and gave it its now household name, Taser. Where did he get the word from? He chose it as an acronym for Thomas A. Swift's electric rifle, referencing the 1911 novel Tom Swift and His Electric Rifle. The keen-eared amongst you will have noticed the A isn't in the book's title, and indeed, Tom Swift is never given any other names, but Cover realised the word was far easier to pronounce with another vowel in it. Though Tom Swift's electric rifle is used to hunt big game in Africa and can shoot through walls, the real Taser was actually developed as a weapon for air marshals, so they could stop hijacking attempts without shooting a hole in the very plane they were trying to save. Firing a gun is one thing you're not meant to do on a plane. Another is have headphones in. during safety briefings and takeoff at least. But the development of smaller and smaller earbuds makes it even harder for air hostesses to actually tell if passengers are actually listening to her instructions on how to secure a seatbelt instead of trying to find a song on their phone that perfectly matches her flailing appendages. And yes, you guessed correctly, earbuds are another invention that sci-fi writers dreamt up long before they were made reality. Fahrenheit 451, written in 1953 and a staple of English classes the world over, describes seashells, which were tiny wearable headphones that fit inside the ear, providing an electronic ocean of sound, music, and talk. What the novel didn't predict is the awkward social encounters these would create when you start talking to someone only to realize too late that he's busy listening to something infinitely more interesting than you through tiny invisible earbuds. But hey, it also mentions friends communicating through a digital wall, which is probably predicting Facebook. So who needs socializing in person when you can do it online from the comfort of your toilet? If you thought predicting AirPods and Facebook in 1953 was impressive, how about predicting blogging in 1835? That's exactly what 19th century Russian prince, no, I'm not making this up, Vladimir Odovsky did in his novel. Admittedly, the novel was titled The Year 4338, so he overestimated how long it would take for us to reach the point where anyone and everyone could write a blog full of angsty poetry and buttock-clenchingly enthralling stories of self-loathing and anxiety during a trip to the supermarket. Clearly, that was a higher priority for us than Vlad realized. But still, for him to have written over 100 years before the dawn of the internet that houses would be connected by means of magnetic telegraphs that allow people who live far from each other to communicate, and that the regular updates people published would cover a family's health, household news, thoughts and comments, all to be shared with the world, he definitely predicted oversharing with total strangers who really couldn't care less about how your guinea pig is doing, or your toddler, who also resembles a guinea pig. Maybe by the time we do actually get to 4338, we'll all finally admit that we don't give a shit about each other's kids and pets. Now, there's arguably one science fiction novel that stands head and shoulders above the rest when it comes to making predictions. Stand on Zanzibar, written by John Brunner in 1969. The book's title comes from a claim at the start of the 20th century that the world's population could all fit stood up on the Isle of Wight. In 2010, when the novel is set, Brunner predicts the Earth's population will be 7 billion and would thus require an area the size of Zanzibar. Brunner was almost spot on. The world's population reached 7 billion in 2011, and that was just the first of many impressive predictions. The book also includes the US being plagued by terrorism and random acts of violence, often at schools, the rise of China as America's most powerful rival, a European Union of nations that nevertheless sees the UK siding with the US, gay and bisexual lifestyles becoming mainstream, in-flight entertainment, motor vehicles running on electric fuel cells, global TV news channels sent via satellite, laser printers, the marginalization of tobacco following a social backlash, a real-time social network, much like Twitter. The list goes on. Although one small detail is almost too hard to believe. A world leader called President Obama. Barack Obama, of course, was elected US president in 2009. Though critics have called some of the predictions a fluke, it's an impressive list nonetheless. And finally, we finish on something that is, well, I'm not going to beat around the bush. It's not a highbrow sci-fi classic, it's The Simpsons. It's hardly a reimagining of the technological limits of our world, and yet it has famously got a fair few predictions right. Who would have thought that Donald Trump would run for, let alone become president, when that episode aired in March 2000? But I'm not going to go through various things The Simpsons got right, because despite some accurate social commentary, they're bound to have done so across 700 episodes. That's besides the point. The reason I want to talk about the show now is a time that They not only predicted the future, but actively influenced it. A 1994 episode featured a bully called Kearney asking a friend of his to take down a memo on his Newton, which was Apple's early attempt at a personal digital assistant. The memo was meant to read, "Beat up Martin," but the device misreads his handwriting as "Eat up Martha." This phrase became a mantra for Apple engineers years later when working on improved iOS software. Their former director of engineering said avoiding an "Eat up Martha" moment motivated the iOS team to ensure the keyboard and autocorrect features for text input were far more accurate. So, perhaps the lesson here is that whatever predictions are made for the future, good or bad, we stand to benefit most if we can learn from them and strive for better. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to check out the Kaspersky Social Ratings project via the link in the description.
Chicken? That's lunch food, dude.
Delicious, toasty English muffin. That's breakfast to me. Plus, it's lunchtime somewhere.
It's good.
The savory chicken McMuffin, made with Canadian-raised seasoned chicken. Just $2.99 plus tax.
Hey, 42 here. The Voynich manuscript is without a doubt one of the most mysterious, inexplicable, and downright intriguing objects on planet Earth today. It has been called a message from God, a hoax, an elaborate secret code, the product of mental illness, a treatise written in a lost language, a guide to an alien world, or simply the notebook of an eccentric scientist written in his own indecipherable shorthand. Since it came to the attention of the public a little more than 100 years ago, it has been served as the inspiration for a plethora of novels, a classical music album, several works of art, and at least one TV episode. It's even appeared as an Easter egg hidden away in more than one popular video game franchise. And yet, this strange artifact, whose story spans centuries and touches the lives of some of history's most colourful characters, is nothing more than a simple book about the size of a modern paperback. If you were to visit Yale's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, where the Voynich manuscript resides today, and leaf through its 240-odd vellum pages, you would find a curious, flowing script in lightly faded brown ink surrounded on almost every page by weird and wonderful painted images depicting people, plants, animals, astrological diagrams, curious contraptions, maps to strange lands, and much more. The odd little book is split into 6 distinct sections: botanical, astrological, balneological, which relates to medicinal springs, cosmological, pharmaceutical, and recipes. All of this sounds interesting enough so far, but alone, it doesn't explain why the Voynich manuscript has attained the status of a true enigma. Nor does the fact that it's over 600 years old. There are plenty of older books out there, tucked away on dusty bookshelves in great libraries across the world, and nobody's thought to make music about any of those. No. What makes the Voynich manuscript so special is much simpler than all of that. Nobody alive has ever been able to read it. Or should I say, nobody alive has ever been able to understand it. Now, you may not be able to read the Voynich manuscript, but you can enjoy thousands of other books with today's sponsor, Blinkist. It probably wouldn't surprise you if I told you there's little I love more than reading non-fiction books. But these days, I rarely get the time. I'm sure you're in the same boat. Well, I've been trying out Blinkist, and it's been a game changer for my daily routine. I listen to a blink whilst I'm having my breakfast every morning, and by the time I've drunk my last sip of coffee, I've learnt new fascinating knowledge and musings from the world's best authors and thinkers. Blinkist condenses insights from the top 3,000 plus non-fiction books into bite-sized 15-minute listens. And if you want to dive deeper, premium members get a whopping 65% off full-length audiobooks that you can listen to right in the Blinkist app. You can use Blinkist to save time and money and learn new things faster than ever before. You can use it for self-improvement, get parenting advice, or learn how to improve your daily workflow even further with blinks such as Atomic Habits by James Clear. Personally, I would recommend 21 Lessons for the 21st Century by Yuval Noah Harari. I've always enjoyed his previous books, and this one is a fascinating insight into what the future might hold for us as a species. The first 100 people to visit my unique link below are going to get unlimited access for 1 week to try it out, completely free. And you can cancel at any time during that period. But if you just can't get enough, then through my link, you'll also get 25% off if you want the full membership. Despite the painstaking attentions of master cryptographers, diligent language experts, learned art historians, and a whole cadre of internet sleuths, not one person has ever been able to make sense of a single word written within the Voynich manuscript's pages. And its strange alphabet has never been seen anywhere else in the world. And then there are those painted images I mentioned. Whilst the people look familiar enough, most of them are rendered completely naked and could stand to lose a pound or two. The plants are much less easily identified. Not a single one of them bears more than a passing resemblance to any of the species found here on Earth. Exactly who wrote the Voynich manuscript, in which language, and for what reason is completely unknown. And just what the hell it's all supposed to mean is a question that has captivated imaginations across the world ever since the book was uncovered by the man it's now named after, Wilfrid Voynich. Voynich was born in November 1865 to Polish parents in the city of Telshi, which was part of the Russian Empire at the time and can be found today in Lithuania. He was something of a free spirit in his younger days, getting himself arrested in his early 20s thanks to his membership of the social revolutionary organization known as the Proletariat, which ultimately led to his imprisonment in Irkutsk, Siberia, a place famous today for its historic town center and for being abysmally difficult to defend in risk. Voynich was a resourceful man, and he managed to escape before his 5-year sentence was up. Keen to put some distance between himself and his turbulent past, he made his way to Hamburg, where he traded his last good waistcoat and a rather dashing pair of glasses for a ticket on a ship bound for England. Voynich dabbled in a little more revolutionary work over the next few years from his new home in London, but perhaps deciding he'd had enough of being shot at and stabbed, and no doubt grown complacent on a steady diet of tea, crumpets, and remarkably orderly queuing, he finally decided to leave his wild days behind him. A highly educated man who is said to have spoken 18 languages, he decided to settle down and get himself a real job as an antiquarian bookseller. Voynich also found love in London, marrying another former revolutionary called Ethel Boole, author of multi-million selling novel The Gadfly, and daughter of George Boole, whose Boolean logic is credited with having laid the foundations for the information age. I've said it before and I'll say it again. All the famous people in the past knew each other. It was in 1912 that Voynich made the discovery, which he is known for today, whilst visiting the Villa Mondragone, which lies about 20 kilometers outside of Rome. Villa Mondragone was owned by a group of Jesuits at the time of Voynich's visit, and despite their grand and prestigious setup, the imposing Villa Mondragone was the site where the Gregorian calendar was first developed. It turned out that the Jesuits were a little strapped for cash. Voynich was more than happy to line their pockets in return for a chance to go home with a few of the rare manuscripts stored in the villa's library. Amongst the 30 items he purchased that day was the book now known as the Voynich manuscript. It was immediately clear to Wilfrid Voynich that this latest addition to his collection was old and more than a little strange. In the 100 or so years since he came into possession of this now legendary artifact, many people, including Voynich himself, have attempted to piece together the manuscript's origins. Its first known owner is thought to have been Rudolf II, or to give him his full title, Rudolf II, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Hungary and Croatia, King of Bohemia, and Archduke of Austria. I think I'll stick with Rudy. Frequent viewers of this channel will be delighted to hear that Rudy was a member of the infamous House of Habsburg. inbreeders extraordinaire, and that, yes, he did indeed have a chin like a sledgehammer. Rudi is thought to have come into possession of the Voynich manuscript towards the end of the 16th century, when it was already some 200 years old. And he is said to have been so intrigued by its curious contents that he bought it from the previous owner for the princely sum, or should that be multiple kingly sum, of 600 Venetian ducats. That's a little more than 2 kilograms of solid gold. Not bad for a tatty old book. King Rudi was a character, to say the least. He's known to have kept a lion and a tiger as part of his prized royal menagerie, and he was so fond of the beasts that they were allowed to roam freely around his home, Castle Prague. Yeah, that went about as well as you might expect. But Rudi wasn't a bad guy, and he was more than happy to pay compensation to the survivors of the unsurprisingly frequent attacks and playful maulings his favourite pets dished out, or more commonly to the deceased's grieving and no doubt irrecoverably traumatised family. He was also a devoted alchemist and pursued a lifelong quest to get his hands on the Philosopher's Stone. Tragically unaware as he was that said mythical object was hidden under a trap door guarded by a three-headed dog at Hogwarts all along. Rudi was also keen on astrology and even commissioned a personal horoscope from French astrologer Nostradamus. Armed with this priceless insight into his own future, you'd think Rudi would have been prepared when his own brother moved against him to take the throne some years later, but apparently not. King Rudolf II died 9 months later, stripped of all his powers, and the mysterious book he'd paid a literal king's ransom for was passed to his personal doctor, Jacobus of Teplitz, whose signature, so faded with age, it's only visible under ultraviolet light, can still be found hidden within the Voynich manuscript's pages today. From Jacobus, the manuscript made it into the hands of George Baresch, a Czech alchemist who would spend the next 20 years of his life attempting to unearth its secrets, chipping away at the mystery in vain until the day he died. Baresch bequeathed the manuscript to a trusted friend in his will, who, in turn, passed the book on to his mentor, the celebrated 17th century scientist Athanasius Kircher, known as the Master of 100 Arts. It seemed like a smart move. Kircher was a learned man who had recently shot to fame as the first person to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphics. Who better to uncover the secrets of an unreadable manuscript? The plan did have one slight flaw though. Despite his claims, Kircher had not in fact deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphics at all, and the majority of his assumptions and translations were later found to be completely false. Make that master of 99 arts then. The Voynich manuscript seems to have proven impenetrable to Kircher, and here it disappeared back into relative obscurity, stashed away in the library of Collegio Romano, where Kircher worked. The manuscript was to remain there, no doubt gathering a thick layer of dust, for more than 200 years, until Rome was captured by Victor Emmanuel II, one-time King of Sardinia, and eventual King of Italy, who promptly confiscated the Collegio Romano's library. Luckily, the college's rector at the time managed to rescue some of the library's most important books, including the Voynich manuscript, transferring the lot to the Villa Mondragoni, where, as we've seen, Voynich would be along to find it some 46 years later. Now, run a simple Google search and you'd be forgiven for thinking the Voynich manuscript had been solved 100 times. There are endless articles and a good dose of YouTube videos, even documentaries out there, claiming the 600-year mystery has finally been defeated. But every time some young hopeful comes up with a new and promising theory, the scientific community stoically steps up to the scholarly plate and bats it out of the park. The very first such claim was put forward by William Newbold, a professor of philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania and a cryptography enthusiast who was hired by Voynich himself to unlock the secrets of his prized possession. Newbold's research led him to the conclusion that the writings within the manuscript was, in fact, meaningless. But that a secret code based on ancient Greek shorthand and visible only with the use of a magnifying glass had been hidden within the letters themselves, disguised as natural patterns within the ink. Ingenious. Newbold claims to have translated entire paragraphs of the text using the code, which revealed the author to be none other than English polymath and Franciscan friar, Roger Bacon. This theory has, unfortunately, been thoroughly debunked. It turns out those secret markings cleverly disguised as patterns within the ink were, in fact, just naturally occurring patterns within the ink. Who'd have thought it? Still, the idea that the Voynich manuscript is some kind of highly elaborate cipher persists, and some of the greatest code breakers to have ever lived and breathed have had a crack at solving it, hoping to uncover some long-lost secret hidden within its pages. Perhaps the most prominent is William F. Friedman. Considered by some to be the greatest cryptologist of the modern age, Friedman was a brilliant man. His team broke Japan's cipher, codenamed Purple, during the Second World War, and he was instrumental in the founding of the NSA in the US, where he was installed as its first chief cryptologist. Friedman was so intrigued by the Voynich manuscript that he put together a crack team of cryptologists to unlock its secrets. This pet project spanned 4 decades of Friedman's life, but despite all his brilliance and dedication, he eventually concluded that solving the Voynich manuscript was, in fact, impossible, suggesting it was written in a made-up language. Friedman isn't the only one to conclude that the manuscript can't be solved for the simple reason that there's nothing to solve, that we can't extract any meaning from its strange pages because there was no meaning there in the first place. Just a lot of rather pretty gibberish. Some proponents of this theory believe that Voynich himself is behind the fabrication. After all, a lost text with links to the likes of Francis Bacon would likely be worth a fortune, something an antique book dealer would know better than anyone. On the face of it, it's quite a compelling argument. Voynich had a clear motive, as well as the know-how to pull it off and make it look good. But the Voynich manuscript isn't just good, it's perfect. And if it really is a hoax, it's one of the most elaborate ever conceived. For a start, the manuscript's pages have been radiocarbon dated to between 1404 and 1438. The idea that Voynich might have been able to get his hands on 240 untouched sheets of 500-year-old vellum made from calf skin in 1912 to turn into a book is near inconceivable. And considering radiocarbon dating wasn't developed until the late 1940s, long after Voynich first publicized his find, it's difficult to see why he would have bothered trying to source such an old material to write on in the first place. The inks and paints used in the manuscript also exactly match those used in early 15th century Europe, something else we've been able to prove only with modern techniques. And the same attention to detail seems to have been paid in the book's language too, which demonstrates statistical features we would expect to see in real natural language, features we also didn't understand back in 1912. Wilfrid Voynich may have had the motive, but he would have needed to be in the possession of the predictive powers of Nostradamus himself to have avoided all the yet-to-be-discovered scientific traps that lay waiting to reveal any deception on his part decades later. The Voynich manuscript, it seems, is very much the genuine article. And to this day, professionals and amateurs alike continue to dedicate countless hours trying to finally solve its many mysteries. And many claim to have solved it once and for all, even presenting examples of fully translated pages. But there's always the inherent issue of how can we trust the veracity of a translation when the only person in the world who claims it's correct is the translator himself. The truth is, so far, every attempt at decoding it has either been declared to be false by an independent body or not peer-reviewed at all, and thus no more than an unverified hypothesis. In 2016, we even let an AI have a crack at it, completely in vain, and in some ways, perhaps that's for the best. Whilst the true meaning behind the unknown text remains a mystery, the Voynich manuscript will continue to stimulate our collective sense of wonder and elicit excited scholarly debate. The moment we figure out that it's actually the world's most ancient and vulgar collection of "that's what she said" jokes, the charming spell will be broken. Thanks for watching. Thanks again to Blinkist for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to check it out using the link in the description.
The Subaru Outback. With its reimagined interior, comfortable seating, and ample cargo space, it's both rugged and refined, like a goat with a bow tie. The new 2021 Subaru Outback, the greatest Outback of all time.
Hey, 42 here. Automata are machines capable of carrying out actions according to a predetermined set of instructions. They are not new inventions, with examples cropping up back in ancient Greece and China. Ctesibius, for example, who is thought to have been the first head of the Great Library of Alexandria, is known to have invented several water-based automata as early as 200 BC. But in 1770, Wolfgang von Kempelen unveiled an automaton, the likes of which the world has never seen before. At the time, most automata were nothing more than fairground attractions, elaborate illusions built with mechanical wizardry and designed to look impressive and lifelike. But von Kempelen's machine was different. Why? Because it could play chess. From a purely technical standpoint, the Mechanical Turk, as von Kempelen's automaton was known, was impressive, able to select any chess piece on the board at will and execute its move perfectly. But it wasn't mere technical mastery that sent shockwaves across Europe when the Turk was first unveiled. Because whilst playing a game of chess is simply a case of moving the pieces from place to place, something any cleverly designed automaton at the time might have achieved, winning a game of chess is another matter entirely. That requires genuine human intelligence. And yet, the Mechanical Turk, a mere machine by all accounts, almost always won. In our world of smartphones and computers, it's hard to imagine just how much of a stir the Mechanical Turk could have caused in its day. We're surrounded by machines that can think, or at least appear to think, on a day-to-day basis. But in 1770, the world looked very different. We were still lighting our homes with fire for a start. The light bulb wouldn't be invented for over 100 years. Back then, concepts that are so familiar to us today, like AI and machine learning, hadn't even made it into the pages of science fiction novels. That's partly because science fiction novels hadn't even been invented yet, of course. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, generally considered to be the first science fiction novel, would not be published for almost 50 years when the Mechanical Turk advanced its very first pawn in 1770. Like many of the world's best inventions, Wolfgang von Kempelen developed the Mechanical Turk to impress a girl. And not just any girl. The Queen of Hungary and Bulgaria, and Archduchess of Austria, Mary Theresa to be exact. Regular viewers will be delighted to hear that Maria happens to be the only female sovereign of the House of Habsburg. My word, those chin-wielding royals certainly got around. Although I am a little sorry to report that Maria Theresa seems to have escaped the signature sledgehammer chin of her kinsman. Perhaps feeling a little left out at her facial inadequacies, in later life she did try and make up for it by cultivating a fairly impressive double chin instead. Got to make the parents proud, eh? The Mechanical Turk was a life-size man carved out of wood that sat before a large cabinet on which rested a chessboard. When von Kempelen first revealed the automaton to Maria Theresa at Schönbrunn Palace, he started by giving the Queen a guided tour of the inner workings of the machine, something that would become his custom at the start of an exhibition. One by one, he would open a series of doors in the cabinet, shining a candle within to reveal a maze of cogs, springs, and gears. Having shown his audience there was no monkey business going on inside the cabinet, von Kempelen then asked for a challenger to step forward to play the Turk. The man who did so was Ludwig von Kombenzel, plenipotentiary minister to the Queen, and for all you conspiracy theory lovers out there, known member of the Illuminati. Unfortunately, his chess game didn't exhibit too much enlightenment, and to the general astonishment of everyone present, he was dispatched by the Turk in under 30 minutes. Several other challengers came forward that day, and the Turk trounced every single one of them. Word of the incredible chess-playing automaton spread across Europe like wildfire. But to everyone's surprise, von Kempelen became strangely coy about exhibiting his machine, often making obscure claims about the need for repairs to avoid taking on challengers. Over the course of the next 10 years, the Turk faced just one more opponent, and after the match, Kempelen dismantled the Turk for good. Or, at least, he would have done had Maria Theresa's son, Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, not ordered him to rebuild his automaton for the state visit of the Grand Duke Paul of Russia. Reluctantly, von Kempelen did so, and the event was another resounding success. Such a success, in fact, that von Kempelen agreed to take the Turk on a tour of Europe. The first stop was France, where the Turk was displayed to the public for the very first time. During their stay in Paris, von Kempelen and the Mechanical Turk took on all comers, including a chess-loving American by the name of Benjamin Franklin, who was working as ambassador to France for the United States at the time. The Turk put the future founding father to the sword. Having said that, whilst the automaton did win more than its fair share of games, against the toughest opponents around, it was occasionally bested, including by Francois-André Danican Philidor, considered to have been easily the strongest chess player of his day, though even he claimed to have been given one of the toughest games of his life. The following years saw the Turk exhibited in cities across Europe, before returning to its original home at the Schönbrunn Palace, where it was to stay until von Kempelen's death in 1804. The following year, von Kempelen's son sold the machine to a man named Johann Nepomuk Malzel for 10,000 francs. It's fair to say that Malzel was something of a character. During his time as owner of the Turk, he would make friends with Ludwig van Beethoven, convincing the composer to write a piece of music for him called The Battle of Vittoria. But Beethoven would later claim Malzel had defrauded him by stealing the score and passing it off as his own, going so far as to call him a rude, churlish man, entirely devoid of education or cultivation. Malzel also found time to take credit for the invention of the metronome, which he patented, despite the fact that Dietrich Nicholas Winkel was the true inventor. Malzel is often erroneously credited with the invention to this day. Don't you just hate it when you invent a gravity-based timekeeping device and get ripped off? Perhaps, unsurprisingly considering what we know about him, Malzel's interest in the Mechanical Turk was largely financial. He even managed to sell the automaton for 3 times what he paid for it at one point, though he bought it back again not long after. Malzel did manage to make improvements to the Turk though, including adding a voice box that allowed it to declare check in French when attacking its opponent's king. To begin with, Malzel only put on exhibitions rarely, but every once in a while, someone would come along looking for a game who he simply couldn't refuse. One such opponent was none other than Napoleon Bonaparte. As we all know, Napoleon was a military general of rare genius, a quick thinker capable of turning any situation to his advantage. That might be why he kicked off his game against the Turk by breaking one of Malzel's golden rules. Napoleon tried to play as white, meaning he took the first move. Napoleon probably expected Malzel to step in, but it was the Turk himself who was having none of the general's shenanigans. The automaton shook its wooden head, then removed the erroneous piece from the board entirely. Napoleon, nothing if not persistent, tried the trick again, and then a third time, at which point his mechanical adversary apparently lost its temper, sweeping its arm across the board and scattering the pieces to the floor. Napoleon had probably had men guillotined for less, but He seemed to like a bit of spunk when it came to automata. To Malzel's relief, the general found the Turk's antics hilarious. Napoleon replaced the pieces on the board himself, allowed the Turk to play white as was its custom, and settled in for chess-based war. Just 19 moves later, outmaneuvered and outgunned, Napoleon Bonaparte was beaten. Whilst people were understandably intrigued and astonished by the mechanical Turk, many were also more than a little perturbed. You see, its invention by von Kempelen came hot on the heels of the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. For the first time in human history, people were beginning to fear that machines might start to replace them in the workplace. It was happening right before their eyes after all. And if one of these machines could truly think for itself, well, the implications were frightening. We see these very same fears today with the rise of automation, robotics, and AI. A machine capable of logical thought was an outlandish idea. But while some people were afraid of the consequences, others were simply struck by the possibilities. A man named Charles Babbage played the Mechanical Turk twice in 1819, losing soundly on both occasions. Despite the losses, or perhaps because of them, the idea of a thinking machine lodged itself indelibly in Babbage's mind. Because, as you'll have learned if you watched my video on quantum computing, Charles Babbage is credited with having drawn up the designs for the very first computer, the analytical engine. And he began work on a precursor to that machine, the difference engine, just 2 years after losing to the Turk. So some people were afraid and others inspired. But there was another common reaction people had to the Turk. When faced with a machine that could think for itself, they called bullshit. In 1826, Malzel took the Turk to America, opening an exhibition in New York that drew people in from all over the country. Amongst them was a young Edgar Allan Poe, known today as a titan of American literature, but at the time just another reporter for the Southern Literary Messenger. Poe was absolutely convinced the Turk was a fake, an elaborate hoax that concealed a simple truth. The intelligence behind the Turk's chess was not mechanical at all, but human. He set about trying to prove his thesis with the doggedness of a detective, tracking those involved with the Turk and watched it play on several occasions. His efforts are thought to have inspired him to create C. Auguste Dupin, a fictional detective who appeared in his story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, the first ever locked room mystery. Dupin, incidentally, a remarkable detective who was helped by his unremarkable assistant to solve seemingly impossible crimes, is thought to have at least partly inspired the creation of, you guessed it, Sherlock Holmes. Poe's investigations soon bore fruit, because in his observations of the Turk's exhibitions, he had seen something strange, or more specifically, someone strange. Poe had noticed a man, William Schlumberger, assisting in the setup and dismantling of the Turk. Schlumberger was of medium build with a pronounced stoop, and whilst Poe always saw him before and after the Turk's games, he never once saw him during them. Even more interesting, Poe discovered that when Schlumberger fell ill one day before the Turk was due to play, the game was mysteriously cancelled at short notice. Had Poe known one other key piece of information about Schlumberger, it would have been an open and shut case. Because Malzel's elusive assistant just so happened to be a European chess master. Poe attempted to uncover the ruse when he published his findings in a popular essay titled Malzel's Chess Player. And while some of his assumptions in the piece were dead wrong, he believed Schlumberger concealed himself within the body of the Turk, for example, Poe was, in general, dead right. The Turk was not the world's first AI. It was an illusion, a magic trick, an 84-year-old hoax that had taken in some of the world's most powerful people, and plenty of others besides. The real genius of the Turk wasn't that it could actually play chess, it was that it was convincing enough to fool so many people for so long. Remember how Wolfgang von Kempelen would open the doors to the Turk's cabinet, one by one, shining a candle on the inner workings? It certainly looked convincing, but it was this consecutive opening of the doors that allowed the trick to work. The complicated machinery von Kempelen had stuffed inside was nothing but a smokescreen, and, for that matter, an actual screen, there to both distract the viewer and conceal the chess player behind. The cogs and gears, which did nothing more than make a racket by the way, didn't actually extend all the way through to the back of the cabinet, leaving a cavity behind, just big enough to house a sliding seat that allowed the chess player within to slip out of sight as the cabinet doors opened and closed. Once the cabinet was shut and the game ready to begin, the hidden player would light a candle, the smoke from which escaped from a tube which exited out of the Turk's turban, and would get ready to play the game. A series of magnets built into the chessboard allowed him to see which moves were being made, and he was able to make his own moves in response using a device called a pantograph, which mirrored his own hand movements on the board above. An illusion it may have been, but it was an incredibly effective one. Incidentally, William Schlumberger wasn't the first chess player to operate the Turk, and he wouldn't be the last. It isn't known who took on the role in von Kempelen's time, but Malzel used several chess players from all over Europe, and it's no wonder the Turk rarely lost. All were strong players. One, William Lewis, is thought to have been the first player in history to have been called a grandmaster. Aside from their playing strength, all of Malzel's chess players shared one thing in common. They were strapped for cash, which is exactly what Malzel used to convince them to play for him. Though a few did manage to get their own back by blackmailing him mercilessly on the threat of revealing his big secret. Unsurprisingly, Malzel left the States not long after Poe's essay was published, taking the Turk to Cuba. But Schlumberger contracted yellow fever during a trip and died, taking the Turk's chess ability with him to the grave. Without a skilled player to operate his automaton, Malzel headed back to the US, depressed. And like many depressed men, he turned to drink. It was to be the death of him. He died from alcohol poisoning during the voyage. The Turk changed hands a couple of times in the years after, eventually being bought by Edgar Allan Poe's personal physician, John Kersley Mitchell, who donated it to the Peel Museum in Baltimore, where it would remain largely forgotten until a fire broke out in the museum in 1854. Mitchell arrived on the scene just in time to watch the Turk burn. Unable to intervene due to the ferocious heat, he claims to have been able to hear the automaton's last desperate words above the roaring flames. Check, 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 check. Well, that's gonna give me nightmares. With the automaton destroyed, Mitchell's son, Silias, decided it was high time to finally come clean. He published a series of essays in Chess Weekly that explained exactly how the Turk had fooled the world. No longer afoot, the game was simply up. The amazing chess-playing automaton had gained great renown in its 84 years, playing in royal courts, going to war with generals, taking on some of the greatest chess minds of its time, and inspiring inventions that changed the world. Its story, which pitted a cold machine intelligence against the best mankind had to offer, captured imaginations around the world in a way that wouldn't be seen again until Garry Kasparov took on IBM's supercomputer, Deep Blue, in 1996. Kasparov was the victor in that one, but IBM and Deep Blue were back the following year, and this time, they took Kasparov down. But, in an interesting parallel to the Mechanical Turk's own story, there were those present who smelt a rat. And since Edgar Allan Poe was long dead by this point, it was left to Kasparov himself could call bullshit. For most of Game 1, Deep Blue had been making the kind of moves Kasparov expected of a computer. Logical, calculated, predictable. But then, in the endgame, the supercomputer made a move that shocked the world chess champion to his marrow. Not because of its strength per se, but because of its imagination. To Kasparov, it didn't seem like a computer move at all, and he became convinced that, just like the Mechanical Turk, Deep Blue was being helped out by a human mind. Or, in this case, a team of chess grandmasters working in tandem to thwart him. It was a conspiracy theorist's wet dream, not least because IBM delayed the release of their computer logs for some time after the match, and even went as far to dismantle Deep Blue after its victory. Reminding anyone of a certain Wolfgang von Kempelen dismantling the Turk after his performance at the Schönbrunn Palace by any chance? And if you're looking for a motive here, look no further. IBM's share price is said to have risen by some 20% in the aftermath of the victory. As it happens, Kasparov was right when he said the stunning, human-like move from Game 1 was not the product of unerring machine logic. But it wasn't the work of a team of chess grandmasters either. So what was it? A bug in Deep Blue's programming, actually, which had prevented the computer from playing its preferred move. To overcome the error, a failsafe mode had kicked in which the supercomputer Deep Blue simply played a move at random. Unlike the Mechanical Turk, whose opponents thought they were playing a machine but were really playing a man, Kasparov thought he was playing a man, when in fact, he was really playing a machine. Still, these days chess computers are light years ahead of the world's best players, and us non-grandmasters are likely to be trounced every time by a simple smartphone application. There's no getting around it. The times when an old chess master hidden in a cabinet behind a big wooden doll could take the world by storm are well and truly over. More's the pity, if you ask me. Thank you for watching. You can now pre-order my new book, Stick a Flag in It, on Amazon. Link in the description. Thank you. Hey, 42 here. On the 21st of August, 1911, the Mona Lisa vanished. But our story begins the night before, as the sun set over Paris and the staff members at the Louvre closed the service entrance at the back of the museum. The lights were shut off. The hallways, normally bustling with tourists, stood silent, and the Mona Lisa smiled her eternally mysterious smile in the Salon Car at the east end of the Grand Gallery. It was a night like any other at the largest art museum in the world, priceless pieces hanging safe and sound on the gallery walls. But one man was readying himself to change the course of art history for good. Around 7 a.m. the following morning, the Louvre's many employees returned for another day of work. Dressed in their signature white smocks, they entered through the service entrance, but a clever thief hid amongst them. Vincenzo Perugia was an amateur painter and, crucially, a former employee at the Louvre. He knew the work patterns at the museum inside out, and that morning, he blended seamlessly into the crowd of employees before slinking away and creeping down the museum's long hallways until he reached the Salon Car, where he set his sights on the Mona Lisa. His plan was simple: steal one of the world's greatest works of art and walk right out of the front door. It was laughably naive, even stupid, but if history has taught us anything, it's that stupid ideas work out a lot more often than they should. Just look at Crocs. The Salon Car, where the Mona Lisa sat on display, was one of the busiest rooms in the Louvre. From the 1840s to the early 1900s, it housed the most iconic masterpieces from Italian Renaissance artists like Fra Angelico, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and Correggio. As one of the most popular areas in the whole museum, the Salon Car was typically packed with art lovers, but on the day in question, the Louvre was closed to the public. Even so, there were plenty of staff lurking around the place, and Perugia had to wait patiently for an opportunity, making himself look busy until he was finally alone. This is where he set into motion his intricate, carefully conceived, and brilliant plan. He grabbed the Mona Lisa from where it hung on the wall and legged it. Perhaps thanks to his knowledge of the building, Perugia somehow managed to escape without being spotted, and minutes later, he disappeared into the streets of Paris, a priceless work of art tucked jauntily under one arm. In what was surely a damning indictment of the truly shoddy security measures in place at the Louvre at the time, it was a full 2 days before anyone reported the painting as missing, at which point the police began a frantic search for the Mona Lisa, but to no avail. They simply had no idea who had carried out the crime or how. At one point, their prime suspect was none other than Pablo Picasso, who was known to harbour a certain disdain for the stuffy traditionalist approach of the Louvre. But he was soon released when the police remembered something quite important. They had absolutely no evidence linking him to the crime. Perugia may not have been a criminal mastermind, but he was smart enough to lay low for a while after the theft. In fact, it was a good 2 years before he made his move, when, true to form, he came up with the genius idea of selling what had become the world's most famous painting to an art dealer in Florence. The dealer immediately reported Perugia to the police, and he was promptly arrested and imprisoned for his crime, serving only 6 months of his year-long sentence behind bars. To some, Perugia was hailed as something of a hero, a patriot who'd brought a masterpiece back home. Others were less charitable in their assessment, seeing him as a desperate thief with a chip on his shoulder. Either way, Perugia is just one of many people who have managed to successfully steal some of the world's most coveted and valuable works of art. And you can steal some of the world's most valuable and coveted knowledge with the enormous range of world-class courses available at the Great Courses Plus, who have kindly sponsored today's video. I absolutely love the Great Courses Plus. I use it every single week. They're incredible courses on every topic you can imagine, from history to physics to cooking, have inspired a huge number of my videos, really. Every one of their 11,000 plus top-notch courses is delivered by a leader in their field, from Ivy League professors to experts from National Geographic, the Smithsonian, and the Culinary Institute of America. Whether you want to learn history, maths, or science, or you just want to play chess well or become a better photographer, I can confidently tell you that there will be a course that will do exactly that for you. Have you ever found yourself looking at some of the world's finest artwork in galleries and thinking, I have no idea what any of that means? Then you need to watch A History of European Art. Art historian William Kloss takes you on a journey through the deep and rich history of European art. He tells you why each style and piece is important and how it changed the course of history. It's an absolute must-watch, if you ask me. The Great Courses Plus is giving my viewers the great offer of a free trial. You can help to support my channel by checking it out via the link in the description. On the 2nd of February 1994, 2 men broke into the National Art Museum in Oslo, Norway. The country was swept up at the time in the 1994 Winter Olympics. And whilst most Norwegians watched alpine and cross-country skiers traverse their Scandinavian mountaintops, the Scream, a famous composition by Edvard Munch, was stolen in a mere 50 seconds. The heist went so smoothly, in fact, the robbers even had time to stop and write a note to the museum staff, which read, "1,000 thanks for the bad security." I think that's what's called rubbing salt into a wound. But as my mother always used to say, pride comes before a fall, or, in this case, being a cocky little shit after stealing a national treasure comes before going to jail. The Scream was recovered 3 months later, and the men responsible were eventually incarcerated. But of all the art heists in history, perhaps the most theatrical took place on the 22nd of December, 2000. This robbery was an Ocean's heist, a James Bond film, and a Fast and the Furious feature all wrapped into one, and it took place at the National Museum of Fine Arts in Stockholm, where thieves targeted a portrait by Rembrandt and 2 small paintings by Renoir. Together, the 3 paintings were valued at around $35 million. The thieves raided the museum with pistols and a submachine gun, holding the guards at gunpoint whilst they ripped paintings off the walls. Across the city, they exploded multiple vehicles to draw police away from the scene of the crime. And just in case that didn't work, they threw nails onto the road outside the museum to puncture the tyres of police vehicles. And the cherry on top, these absolute badasses made their great escape in a getaway speedboat. They may have been criminals, but goddamn did they have style. Despite the elaborate heist, these thieves didn't fare much better than the rest. The stolen paintings were recovered within 5 years, with the men responsible thrown behind bars. Safe to say, it wasn't the Hollywood ending they were hoping for. When we examine these notorious robberies, we start to see a few patterns. First, the average heist is exceptionally fast, between 5 and 10 minutes in total. Some, like the 1994 heist in Norway, took less than a minute. The faster you go, the better, despite what your girlfriend keeps telling you. These robberies also all took place in broad daylight. At night, museums lock their doors and close the vaults. They turn on security cameras, motion detectors, and burglar alarms. But during the day, the doors stay open and the sensors stay off. Yes, the museum's halls may be crowded with people, but if our Italian friend Perugia taught us anything, it's that people can be deceived. Motion sensors? Not so much. We can also see patterns in the aftermath of each crime. All these paintings were stolen successively, but within a few years the guilty parties were brought to justice and the stolen paintings were returned to their rightful place on the gallery walls. Ironically, many of those paintings grew more famous after they were stolen. The Mona Lisa, for example, skyrocketed in popularity following its theft and recovery in 1913. And the story is a big part of the reason the painting is perhaps the most famous in the world today. Turns out, the world loves an intriguing heist. Speaking of intriguing heists, the robbery of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in 1990 is one of the most interesting of them all. Not only does it represent the single largest theft of private property in history, but it was also a heist that broke all the rules. And despite the fact the crime was committed over 3 decades ago, the FBI are still chasing leads to this day. Isabella Stewart Gardner was an art enthusiast and world traveller. Her passion for art history yielded a spectacular collection of paintings, sculptures and literature. She constructed her own museum in Boston in 1901 and displayed her first exhibit 2 years later. It soon became clear hers was a collection unlike any other in the world, at least in private hands. It featured monuments from the Italian Renaissance, bold paintings from the Dutch masters, and rare ancient Chinese sculptures. Over the years, the Gardner Museum grew and expanded to include a botanical garden, a music hall, and dozens of new paintings. But on the 18th of March, 1990, tragedy struck. In the early hours of the morning, police discovered a confusing scene at the museum that looked like the aftermath of a Renaissance BDSM party. 2 security guards were bound and gagged in the basement, chunks of valuable antique picture frames were scattered across the floor, and the once decorated walls of the Gardner Museum lay bare. The museum was equipped with infrared motion sensors that had recorded the progress of 2 thieves as they moved through the building. Using this data, police reconstructed a minute-by-minute walkthrough of the entire heist, which took an incredible 81 minutes in total, far longer than any of those we covered earlier. The Gardner thieves also entered the museum in the middle of the night, braving sensors and security measures, and they escaped with approximately $600 million in booty. Sometimes it pays to break the rules. So, how exactly did these 2 lone thieves pull it off? The robbery began at 1:24 a.m. on the morning after St. Patrick's Day, a holiday fueled by raucous celebrations clowns, drunken mistakes, and fully grown men dressed as leprechauns. At 1 in the morning, partygoers were still shouting, singing, and pinching each other up and down the streets of Boston. Inside the Gardner Museum, a buzzer sounded at the front desk where 2 security guards were in the middle of their shift. Someone was at the door. 2 someones, in fact. Boston's finest police officers. A disturbance had been reported at the property, and the policeman wanted to take a look around. The security guards obliged. After all, on Paddy's Day, disturbances weren't just possible, they were pretty much expected. As the police officers approached the front desk, one of the security guards noticed something strange. One of the men appeared to be wearing a fake mustache. As you can imagine, alarm bells started ringing immediately. Not actual alarm bells, which would have been very handy at the start of a robbery, but the internal something's not quite right variety, which are good for keeping you out of trouble but less good for museum security. Now, as you're all no doubt aware, impersonating an officer is a crime, but impersonating a mustache is far, far more serious. Unfortunately, before the security guard had a chance to shoot the imposter dead on the spot, the police officer struck, subduing the guards, blindfolding and gagging them before bundling them into the basement, where they were handcuffed to metal pipes. At 1:48 a.m., the thieves crept into the galleries of the Gardner Museum. Their first stop was the Duck Room, one of the most famous galleries in the building, and home to the works of masters like Rembrandt and Vermeer, whose paintings sell for millions at auction. As soon as the thieves entered the room, the museum's motion detectors went off, capturing every step they took, and pinging off a warning that read, "Someone is in the Dutch room, investigate immediately." Unfortunately, the alert went no further than the now abandoned front desk, where it would repeat over and over again throughout the night. Incredibly, despite the museum being home to literally billions of dollars worth of artwork, 2 middle-aged and apparently rather gullible men were the sum total of meaningful security in the place. The thieves got to work, setting their sights on Gardner's prized possession, the Storm of the Sea of Galilee, the only seascape Rembrandt ever painted. The 2 thieves pulled the masterpiece down and placed it on the floor along with another large Rembrandt. Brandishing Stanley knives, they hacked the paintings from their frames. The frames themselves were precious antiques, but apparently the thieves were none the wiser, as they tore them to bits, strewing the pieces around the floor, like bodies in the wake of a massacre. Of the 13 total pieces stolen from the Gardner Museum that night, 6 were taken from the Dutch room, including Vermeer's concert, one of just 34 surviving paintings attributed to him today, and thought to be the most valuable unrecovered painting in the world. So far, it seems the thieves knew exactly what they were doing. Sure, they'd broken a few valuable frames, but the paintings they'd chosen were worth far more. But their next move left investigators stumped. Beside the stolen Vermeer in the Dutch room stood an ancient Chinese vase-like vessel known as a bloon. Unlike the canvases lining the walls, this old pot was not especially valuable. Yet, for some reason, the thieves were determined to have it. That's like walking into an open bank vault, ignoring the piles of bills and instead struggling with a handful of pennies. From here on in, their actions only became stranger. Having spent a good 20 minutes bumbling around the Dutch room, that's basically a lifetime in heist years, the thieves took the time to loosen dozens of tiny screws, protecting a series of small prints in one corner. Remember that we're smack in the middle of a dangerous heist here, and the police could show up at any moment. Yet, the 2 men busted out the Christmas cracker-sized screwdrivers and went to town, whilst far more valuable work stood unmolested elsewhere in the museum. All this DIY seems to have proved rather distracting, because the thieves managed to forget all about the multi-million-dollar Rembrandt they'd left laying face down on the floor, which was eventually found by museum staff the following day. In all, the thieves spent a casual 40 minutes in the Dutch room, stealing things seemingly at random. At this point, one of the thieves took the time to poke his head around the corner of the red room, which at the time housed some of the most valuable artwork, not just in the the museum, but the entire world. Any robber worth his salt would have filled his boots and bagged himself some swag. But this guy just looked around for a minute or two like a tourist in the Louvre, then left without touching a thing. Instead, he ambled down to the short gallery and nabbed himself 5 small sketches by French impressionist Degas, then went after an historic flag, the Imperial Guard of the Emperor Napoleon. The flag was housed in a case lined with more of those tiny screws, so out came the screwdriver once again, only this time the thief got bored halfway through and gave up. Perhaps out of anger, perhaps to defend his fragile ego, he nabbed a small bronze eagle from the tip of the flag instead, carrying the 5 drawings and the eagle downstairs. He passed yet another multi-million-dollar gallery called the Chinese Room, which contained many statues far more valuable than either the Chinese goo or the bronze eagle. But he ignored the gallery completely as well. At 2:45 a.m, the 2 thieves had met back up again and began to pack their getaway car, which was parked near the museum's employee entrance. They stashed 10 paintings and 2 statues into the boot. But there was still one thing left to steal. This final theft remains the most mysterious part of the Gardner heist. Up to this point, the museum's motion detectors have picked up every single step the robbers took. We can trace their entire path through the museum, as they moved from piece to piece until those final moments. The last painting taken was a man hung in the view. But curious, not a single step was recorded on the gallery's motion detectors, which were found to be working perfectly by experts in the aftermath of the heist. It was almost like a ghost had crept in and spirited the painting away, never to be seen again. According to the head of security, the heist at the Gardner Museum looks like 2 separate crimes wrapped into one. For 81 minutes, amateur thieves carried out a long and careless raid of the Gardner's galleries. They set off censors, they left priceless merchandise behind, and generally seemed to have very little understanding of the relative values of the items they chose to steal. Don't even get me started on those tiny bastard screws. But in the closing minutes of the Gardner heist, they became artful and quick. The pair were monitored around the museum for 81 minutes, yet piece number 13 disappeared without a trace.